Our guest today, Grant Norbury, is from where, Grant? Where are you living?
Alexandra.
The title of this with Grant is Could Rabbit Numbers Soar in a Predator-Free Future? I thought rather than an intro about you and where you are and how you got to where you are, I thought you've got a bit to cover and people want to hear about the rabbits. So why don't we just get into it?
Well, kia ora koutou. Thanks everyone for coming online to hear this. Yeah, I live in Alexandra, which is, for New Zealand, it's the rabbit mecca pretty much. And I started working with the rabbit land management program about 30 years ago. And now I'm working on predator-prey dynamics in these dryland systems. So that's the title of my talk. Basically, the question, an important question, especially for Predator-Free 2050, is will predator control lead to rabbit increases? Now, there's a lot at stake here because rabbits, as we all know, can have devastating impacts on farming. Control costs can be upwards of $100 per hectare for aerial knockdown, $30 a hectare for maintenance. So there's a lot of nervous landholders out there, and public perceptions are important because many landowners and members of the general public, they apply the intuitive logic that if predators consume rabbits, they must regulate their numbers. And therefore, if predators are removed, as shown here, rabbit numbers are going to increase. Now, indeed, John Flux, a retired DSIR scientist, published this paper in European Journal of Ecology a few years ago, and he said this in that paper that the current government-approved proposals to exterminate predators by 2050 risk a return to the major rabbit problems we had in the 80s and mid-1900s, unless rabbits are removed first. So that's a pretty profound statement there, and I hope you see from my talk that predator-prey dynamics are really that simple. I actually agree with what John says at the end of that comment, but it's not for the reasons that he outlines, and I'll talk about that later. So in terms of the evidence, there's been quite a lot published on rabbit dynamics in New Zealand and around the world, including interactions with predators. So a few years ago, Chris Jones and myself, we reviewed that information and published it in Mammal Review. If you want to look at that paper, there's my email address. Send me a message and I'll send you the PDF. But it summarizes a lot of what I'm going to talk about here today. It's important we think about rabbits in an ecosystem context. We can't look at them in isolation with just predators. There's what's called top-down and bottom-up processes. So predation is a top-down process, as is rabbit hunting. Drowning, diseases, bottom-up processes are things like food and climate and soils. There's a whole lot of things affecting rabbit abundance. And if we look at New Zealand, let's just look at New Zealand evidence. There's been a number of studies in New Zealand on predator effects on rabbits. The Gibbs study, this was a 10-year study in the Wairarapa inside an 8-hectare enclosure. For the first 6 years of that study, rabbits increased until they exhausted their food supply. Then the numbers collapsed. The predators, cats and ferrets, they lagged behind the rabbits. They were allowed to come and go inside that fence as they chose. They lagged behind the rabbits, but the authors concluded that predation accelerated the rabbit collapse. So then rabbits remained low until predators were removed, and then they increased to a higher peak than previously recorded before crashing again as the food supplies were exhausted. So there's a lot of dynamics going on in there. The authors argued that during that low rabbit phase, predators were holding rabbits in a low level or a predator pit because they are able to persist by feeding on other prey besides rabbits. So this is an interesting experiment, but there are problems. It's a single population. It wasn't replicated. There was no non-treatment. Therefore, other factors that affect rabbit dynamics, such as climate and rainfall, they couldn't be accounted for. And indeed, rainfall increased during the rabbit increase phase, so it's impossible to estimate the relative effects of predation and increased food availability on rabbit recovery. The Gillies study was in Trouncen Kauri Park in the North Island. He had a predator control site and a no predator control site, but it's difficult to account for the influences other than predation. For example, there was no pre-treatment monitoring of rabbit numbers at that non-treatment site. And that may have had fewer rabbits anyway, perhaps due to RHD or lower resource availability. Plus, there was high variability in rabbit abundance after predator control began, suggesting that there are other factors driving rabbit numbers, such as RHD, hemorrhagic disease, or changes in food supply. If we look at the REDX studies, Ben showed some evidence of a predation effect in combination with rabbit hemorrhagic disease. He had treatment and a non-treatment site in North Canterbury and another pair in Central Otago. RHD broke out on all the sites, and the subsequent rabbit declines were steeper where there were predators. So predation was sort of helping the RHD decline. That only happened in North Canterbury. It didn't happen in Central Otago. The Norbury study was a 3-year project we did in Otago. We had 2 sites where we controlled predators and 2 where we didn't. The first year of that study had no rabbit control at all, but we found no effect. Rabbits just did what they did with no effect of predation. The Barron study has just been completed. This is a study done by Mandy Barron looking at data in Hawke's Bay, and there was no effect. I'm going to show you that study right now, though. Let's look at the Hawke's Bay study. This is based on rabbit spotlight data and camera trap data. This rabbit spotlight data was been collected over the years by Hawke's Bay Regional Council. They're the squiggly lines, by the way. They're the spotlight routes. Up the top, you've got Aotearoa in the north, and you've got Cape to City in the south. So the pink lines are predator control sites, purple where there's no predator control. The dots down at Cape to City are camera traps looking out for rabbits in Cape to City only. Again, pink dots, predator control, purple, no predator control. Let's have a look at the results. This is just the spotlight data. You can see with predator control on those 2 top sites and no predator control at the bottom. This is a Aotearoa. There was no significant difference in rabbit counts between the predator control treatments, despite those noticeable increases in rabbits at the 2 treatment sites in 2019 and 2020. Now, those 2 years were 7 years after predator control began. So if there was a predator control effect, that would have come in much earlier than 7 years. Because remember, an adult doe rabbit can produce 42 to 48 young per annum in areas where they breed most of the year. So we think something else is going on with those 2 sites at the end. If you look at Cape to City spotlighting, again, you'll see where the predator control sites are, and you'll see that, in fact, there's no response there at all. In fact, most of the rabbits are on the non-predator control sites where predators are present. So conflicting information there. Let's look at the camera spotlight data. Now, this is here you're looking at before predator control began. So on the left in the green is the no predator control site. The blue is where predators were controlled. This is before anything happened, so everything was pretty much the same. After predator control, we got this. So again, there's a couple of sites there that were higher, but by and large, there's no statistical effect of predator control on camera trap rates in Cape City. So in summary, despite a couple of the treatment sites showing high rabbit numbers, the effects of predator control on rabbit abundance indices in Hawke's Bay were contradictory and inconclusive. So suggesting that predator impacts on rabbits are minor compared with other factors. So in sum, none of the experiments in New Zealand provide compelling evidence for a top-down effect of predators on rabbit abundance. The evidence, however, for other extrinsic factors influencing rabbit dynamics is stronger. So I'm going to show you here. These studies here show that while loss of young rabbits to predation is sometimes high, mortality caused by other factors such as disease, flooding of burrows, burrow collapse, are of equal or greater importance than predation. The Gibbon-Williams study was in drier areas. They found that seasonal food productivity pulses and lower juvenile mortality allows rabbits to reach higher densities. Recall that breeding information I showed you before of the number of the productivity of an adult doe. It way exceeds that of predators. They're just way more fecund. So favourable environmental conditions maximise rabbit reproduction, including soil type. This is by Robert Shaw. Soils play an important role for rabbit dynamics. And pasture development through the replacement of thick indigenous vegetation, replacement of that with productive pasture species and application of fertilisers, that really boosts rabbits as well. I'll show you some work we did around McRae's Flat. This graphic here, the dark, if you can see my cursor, that sort of darker brown stuff is intact tussock, native tussock, and the lighter green stuff all around here is pasture. The red squares are rabbit abundance based on pellet accumulation, and the bigger the square, the more rabbits there are. So you can see inside this dense tussock, rabbits aren't as abundant as out here where pasture is being developed and on the edge here. The yellow symbols are tracking tunnels and camera data for cats and ferrets. And you can see that they are mostly abundant out here in the pasture tussock boundary. In the middle of the tussock, we didn't find a lot of cats and ferrets at all because the rabbits weren't really there. So this is a process called landscape supplementation. You alter the landscape and it boosts rabbits and it boosts predators. So let's look at some of the international literature. Look at some Australian studies here. Australian studies are complicated by environmental variation. So most of the predator control experiments in Australia show some effect of predation on rabbits, but it only appears to moderate the overwhelming effects of environmental conditions and food supply on rabbit population growth. So if we look at Newsom, Peck, Robley, they showed that drought reduced rabbit numbers dramatically in semi-arid areas. Predation by foxes and cats held rabbits at low levels for longer periods than where predators were removed. When the drought ended, rabbits recovered where predators were present, albeit at a slower rate, suggesting that predation is unable to stop climate-induced rabbit eruptions, because predators are seasonal breeders, whereas rabbits can breed throughout the year with suitable conditions. Risby in WA shrubland showed that when rainfall increased, rabbit numbers increased on fox control sites, but they remained low on untreated sites. And then the Banks study, he showed evidence for fox removal effects on rabbits in subalpine forest grassland habitat, but it wasn't consistent across sites. And Davey showed no effect of fox removal in a temperate grass woodland, but he did show that there were positive effects of rainfall on rabbit numbers. In fact, the greatest response of rabbit populations to rainfall occurred where foxes were present. So if we now look at these authors here, they all found that rabbits are driven primarily by climate and its effects on food abundance and quality, and by disease. Rabbits are affected by disease. That's mostly coccidiosis in wetter areas and myxomatosis since the 1950s and RHD since the mid-1990s. So in sum, for Australia, bottom-up effects appear to be the primary driver of rabbit dynamics in Australia, although under certain conditions, when rabbit numbers are low following drought or disease, predation can limit population recovery. So the story is not simple, but there is a common theme emerging. So a lot of you might know about Macquarie Island while we're still on Australia. You might know about what happened at Macquarie Island. Now, this paper here by Bergstrom and others showed that following cat eradication on the island, rabbits increased substantially. And that resulted in island-wide ecosystem effects that's been quite well documented. Now, another paper was published by John Dowding and others that questioned this study. They argued that their modelling of rabbit eruption was flawed, their conclusions were unsupported, and they suggested that the rabbit increase that they found on Macquarie was due to a combination of other factors like fewer releases of the myxoma virus, abundant food after 20 years of vegetation recovery, release from cat predation was one of the effects, and climate variability. So there's a whole lot of other things that they were arguing was going on. And of course, Bergstrom got back at them and said, oh, here's my response to your response. They said, We affirm our position that top-down control of rabbit numbers by cats prior to their eradication was occurring on Macquarie Island, but they said, we agree with Dowding et al. That systems with multiple invasive species represent complex situations that require careful scrutiny. So that's how that debate has been going on. Let's look at Europe now. Predator impacts on rabbits on the Iberian Peninsula, which is primarily Portugal and Spain, where rabbits are indigenous. They're difficult to interpret because rabbit survival and reproduction are driven by a variety of other factors, such as disease, hunting by humans, and habitat quality. So Delibes, Matias et al., they cautioned that it's still unclear whether control of generalist predators in the Iberian Peninsula allows rabbit populations to increase. Now, Troutman and Saw, they reviewed the evidence for predator impacts on rabbits in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, and they found that high rabbit numbers are generally associated with low predator numbers. Okay, but they didn't control for other influences in their study. They suggested that predators have their strongest regulatory effect during and after rabbit numbers have been reduced by other factors, and that predators have little effect on high-density populations of rabbits. Now, as in Australia and New Zealand, this is now a whole bunch of evidence here I'm showing you that rabbit populations on the Iberian Peninsula appear to be influenced mostly by bottom-up processes such as habitat, food, rainfall, and shelter, and by disease. That's the Marino study. Similarly, elsewhere in Europe, the Petrovan and the Conciotis study, elsewhere in Europe, others have concluded that although predators influence rabbit abundance, predation is less important than the bottom-up effects of food and habitat. So that's the evidence, or lack thereof, for top-down effects of predators on rabbits. I'm going to change tack now. I'm looking at the evidence for the other direction, the bottom-up effects of rabbits on predators. In New Zealand, the evidence for bottom-up effects of rabbits on predators is more compelling than the top-down effects of predators on rabbits. Certainly, this is the case in rabbit-prone areas of Central Otago and Mackenzie Basin. I'll start with the first two studies listed there, Norbury, McGlinchey and Cruz. So both of those studies looked at a huge data set gathered by the Rabbit and Land Management Program. It was a spotlighting data set over Otago and Canterbury over a number of years, it was over 5 years, from 1990 to 1995, for 66 transects, spotlight transects, across pastoral regions in those two areas. So I'll show you the study from Norbury McGlinchey. What we've done there is we lined up all the transects so that rabbit poisoning, this is aerial poisoning of rabbits, coincided where that 0 is indicated on the x-axis. And each of those numbers beforehand is the year before poisoning, and to the right, the year after poisoning. And the black bars are the number of rabbits per spotlight kilometre. So the years before poisoning, heaps of rabbits, then the poisoning was very effective. You can see that the black bars are quite low. So what did predators do? Look at the shaded bars now. You can see that predators were relatively high before poisoning and then relatively low after poisoning. So that showed a fairly clear result based on those data. So Jen Cruz and others, they looked at the same data for cats in particular, and they showed what we call a numerical response. So they related rabbit abundance to the abundance of cats, which are also spotlighted, and there you get a positive trend showing the same thing, basically. And then if we look at another study we did around around Alexandra and in the Mackenzie Basin, we had 3 sites. 2 of them we controlled rabbits, and another site we didn't control rabbits, and we also spotlighted the predators. Again, we got that sort of positive numerical response, suggesting that rabbits are driving the predators. Plus, in New Zealand, there's been numerous studies done by Recio and others showing a strong spatial association between where rabbits are and where cats are in the landscape. In other words, where there's lots of rabbits, you'll usually find lots of cats. And that was a very comprehensive spatial analysis. In Australia, similar evidence that these studies concluded that rabbits have a large effect on the abundance of predators. And in Europe, these studies showed that rabbits appear to, quote, drive the abundance of some generalist predator species rather than the other way around. So that's the evidence for this bottom-up effect. So just a sort of, this paper here by Tom White reviewed a wide taxonomic and geographic range of studies that looked at the relationship between predators and their prey. And Tom concluded that predators that are adapted to co-evolved prey, such as cats and ferrets to rabbits, because they co-evolve together, they generally do not regulate their numbers. That was from a generic study of predators and prey in general. But for rabbits in particular, he said that they're influenced primarily by resources, and while predators have some effect, they tend to ride the back of rabbit abundance. And he sort of summed that up in this catchphrase that predators are passengers, not drivers of rabbits. Okay, so that's that. So the evidence reviewed here is reasonably consistent, that rabbit population dynamics are typically driven by processes other than predation. And there's good evidence that in many circumstances, rabbit abundance drives the abundance of predators. However, certainly acknowledge there are times and places where it appears that predator removal does lead to rabbit increases, but I hope I've convinced you about the relative importance of these bottom-up and top-down processes. So on that theme of if it's mostly a question of rabbits driving predators, I think all in all, we should be thinking about that as a means of helping to reduce abundance of introduced mammalian predators, rather than rabbits being a risky outcome of predator control. And this concept spelled out in this review by Finlayson and others, where they concluded that restoration of Australia's arid zone ecosystems would be hastened if rabbit control was recognised as being equal to predator control and a better balanced integrated approach was taken. And I think that's the way we need to think about rabbits in New Zealand as well. They are part of a bigger equation out there, and it would be useful to focus on rabbit control as a means of helping predator-free New Zealand. So I was just going to finish with some rabbit control issues, if we are going to think like that. And there's many issues with rabbit control. What options are you going to use? Well, we've got rabbit hemorrhagic disease working away out there to various effects. We've got the use of toxins. We've got the use of shooting. Scale is also an issue. Here's a study we did in Otago where we looked at the rabbit poison area on the x-axis and the proportional decline in ferret density based on capture mark recapture. And you can see that it's an increasing curve because the bigger the area, the more impact you're going to have on the population inside. In other words, if the area is too small, you'll get constant reinvasion by ferrets. So the bigger you can make it, the better. The other issue, of course, is costs of rabbit control. So for a 5,000 hectare area, for example, over 5 years, aerial toxin at $50 per hectare per year for 10 years. That can be up in the millions compared with predator trapping, which might be more in the $500,000. And the other thing we need to consider is prey switching, a short-term effect. So it's great that rabbit control reduces predator numbers, but that doesn't happen instantaneously. Predators will switch to other secondary prey before their numbers decline, and that effect wanes. But we've got a short-term window there of a problem. Here's a feral cat from Macrae's with its belly full of native lizards after a major prey switching event. So that's something we need to be cognizant of. And finally, I keep saying finally, but this one I think is finally, Another issue, as I mentioned earlier, is land management. Now, in modified systems, habitat is a key driver of rabbit abundance. So as we know, rabbits prefer open grasslands. They're less abundant where the vegetation's thick and complex. And there's been a few studies in Europe that have shown that, have demonstrated that. And we have local council policy that focuses on land development that often leads to rabbit erupt or rabbit increases and therefore predator problems. So what we need to, another way of reducing predation or predators is to thicken up the landscape. Don't modify it so much. Allow it to restore, or indeed don't destroy complex vegetation in the first place. So these are even a lower bottom-up driver of the whole problem. A lot of it stems back to how we use land. So that's a really interesting concept. So if I come back to the question, the title of the talk, I must say I've made a bit of a rod for my back because I'm wary of blanket rules in ecology that say it's either this or it's that. But what we can say from the science is that on average, rabbits should be seen more as a help to predator-free New Zealand via rabbit control rather than a hindrance via outbreaks following predator removal. So human perceptions and opinion, however, may decide otherwise because it's a very contentious topic. But hopefully for this audience, that's not the case. And I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well done. Gosh, you zipped through that really well. That was fantastic. And what we ask people to do while you just take a breather or a little drink is to write any questions you may have that while we've got Grant here, everybody, we can get his expertise. When it comes to rabbits, I think you've been in the rabbit game for how long, Grant?
Well, I've been in New Zealand for nearly 30 years, and I did start on the question the projects we were doing we were actually measuring the effects of rabbit control on predator abundance. Yes, we were doing stuff like that, and I've dabbled in RHD as well, but so not the entire 30 years, but early on in my career I did. Yeah.
I'm just going to hit you with a couple of questions that I did see come through. Graham asked a question in the middle of your presentation: why have you discounted the flux study?
Because I disagree that with John, not John's study, that paper. He said in that paper, he said that we could return to the years of rabbit plagues, basically, if we remove predators from the landscape. And I don't think that's necessarily an outcome because rabbits are controlled by so many other factors, not predation. Predation plays a role here and there, but rabbit dynamics are influenced by extrinsic factors other than predation.
Joe C asks, hi Grant, how do you think climate change will affect rabbits in New Zealand?
It's a really good one, that. Yeah, well, a study done by Dave Latham and others showed that because of the contracting winter periods, winters are getting warmer. In the really rabbit-prone areas of New Zealand, we rely on them eating bait, particularly aerial control for knockdown, and so we need them to be hungry. And they're very hungry when things get really cold, frosty and icy. They'll take bait nicely. Now that window of opportunity for doing that is closing and closing. So that's a problem for rabbit control. And in terms of just rabbit abundance across the country, it depends on whether New Zealand's going to become more arid or more wet. We think it'll be more wet given recent information. And indeed, more wet is a prediction for a lot of New Zealand. So that would, I would say, be good for us because it'll make it harder for rabbits to live. They like it dry and open. Yep.
So Greg asks, so should Predator Free 2050 change its strategy to target rabbits? Good question.
Predator Free 2050's got enough on its hands without doing rabbits as well. I'd love to say yes. That would make perfect sense. But
Are you able to just tell me and tell us what are the hotspots in New Zealand for rabbits at the moment of numbers?
The hotspots are Central Otago, Mackenzie Basin, Hawke's Bay, and they're the hot spots, I guess. There'll be all sorts of other areas in New Zealand and people will be raising their hand. And what about me? Because there are little bits here and there, but they're the three sort of major areas. Wairarapa as well, parts thereof. Yeah.
Morris asks, if we replace short grass with long grass and tussock, could hares replace rabbits and be a problem too?
Hares never get to the density that rabbits do. So we don't know a lot about hare impacts in our environments, to tell you the truth. But they certainly eat vegetation, but they don't get to anywhere near the levels that rabbits do. It's interesting, that question, because John Flux, going back to John, he did a lot of work on interactions between rabbits and hares, and he says that on islands, hares will actually exclude rabbits from a system due to just competitive interactions, behavioural interactions, or whatever the mechanism is. So there's an interesting interaction going on there.
Graham asks from Petone, most predator-free work is urban or peri-urban. So how relevant are the rural studies?
Oh, well, we've got to go there eventually. The rural studies will become very important as we move out into open farmland. And a lot of the predator-free stuff is happening across farmland. Hawke's Bay, Taranaki, parts of the South Island. There's a lot going on in rural. The question of whether rabbit control can assist predator control in these urban, peri-urban areas, it may not be so relevant depending on the abundance of rabbits.
Practical question from Daniel. What's the methods to eliminate the last few in an area we're trying to heavily control?
The last few rabbits, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Boy, it's interesting, hey? Because, if you look at some of the sanctuaries around New Zealand, the predator-free sanctuaries, including one we've got here near Alexandra, it's the lagomorphs that are the problem, getting the last lagomorphs out, not the predators. So I'm talking hares and rabbits here. So getting the last ones out is try thermal scoping, thermal work in cold mornings with a gun, if you can, to get the last ones out. Maybe some strategic trapping.
Rebecca asked, what would be the best methods for rabbit control across small areas, example 10 to 20 hectares? Is probably similar than you've just mentioned. Would that be right?
Yeah, there are other options. There's pendone poison that you can buy off the counter. There's shooting, if you can do shooting. You can't always. It's mainly really ground poisoning, and there's various ways you can do that. It's a big subject. I'm not an expert on rabbit control per se, but the audience here, I'm sure there's others that know more about that than me. But for 20 to 30 hectares, yeah, shooting, poisoning, some dogging maybe.
Sarah asks, to avoid the problem of prey switching, would the best practice then be to conduct rabbit control in conjunction with predator control?
Yeah, it would be. Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's a difficult one, that, because if you're going to go ahead and do a whole lot of predator control simultaneously with rabbit control, you're kind of not using the benefit of the rabbit control, I guess. But no, I think that's rabbit control is only a supplement. It's just something to help predator control along the way. So you're still going to have to do predator control, and so yeah, bringing it in a bit earlier to offset a prey switch could be a good idea. Because it's the bulk of predators. It's that 90% of predators that's pretty easy to remove.
Yep.
If you get rid of those, you might be reducing your prey switching problem quite well. It's getting the last 10% or 5% is a real problem, as everyone knows.
SS asks, hi Grant, excellent presentation. Do you think the regional council control models are working, or do you have some suggestions for more radical overarching framework?
It's a hard, rabbit control is a hard game to be in, technically and socially.
Yes.
Councils get themselves in a lot of trouble. It's very difficult for them to do it. There's more opposition to poisoning these days, particularly aerial poisoning. I think councils do a pretty good job. They've got to do law, enforcement and so forth. Pretty good job. Is there another model? Well, I don't think there is. I mean, we're always looking for silver bullets and immunocontraception and gene drives and all that, and hopefully that'll come to the fore. But it's long-term stuff. There's always going to be social opposition to anything genetic and so forth. I really think rabbits are going to win the war in the end. We can only do just like predators, we can only do our best in intensified areas. Yeah.
Tom asks, are kill traps effective at suppressing rabbits? And what are the best baits, trap types, etc. currently, in your opinion?
I thought I'd get a question like that. I'm not qualified to answer that. Rabbits generally have a problem going into cage traps. They don't like it, nor do a lot of animals, actually. So leg hole traps are an option where you can obscure and hide the leg hole trap. You've got to use traps that are NAWAC approved, by the way. Ferreting. Ferreting is a very good method. You need someone who's an expert with ferrets and so forth. And you need to know where the rabbits are down holes and all that sort of stuff. But I think, what was the other question? Toxins and things like that.
Yeah, just baits, really. Yep.
Baits, pindone. Yeah, the cereal baits that you can buy for rabbit control from agricultural stores.
Grant asks, hi, Grant. Just wondering, what are the average duration time frame of most of these projects? Because, as we all know, predator-prey population fluctuations can occur naturally, separate from one another. So does any research collect data on both populations over multiple cycles of change? Big question.
Yeah, I assume he's meaning the stuff I was just talking about, the evidence, the studies I was talking about. Yeah, they vary from, some are short-term, some are longer-term. But I hope you got that message that they are, there's all sorts of things driving predator-prey dynamics, and they are bouncing all over the place. That's what the evidence is showing, basically. They're bouncing all over the place. So it's very hard to answer that question of, does predator control lead to a rabbit eruption? Basically, the answer is no, because we can't tell, because it's just too noisy. I may not have answered your question entirely there, but
you gave it a good go. Nathan asks, though, trapping and dogs got the last rabbits in their wildlife fence area.
Oh, yeah. Yep. That could be Nathan at McRae's.
It certainly is.
Yes. Hi, Nathan. That's trapping and dog. Yeah, cool. Yep. Great. There you go. Yep.
Do you think that regenerative farming practices that have longer pastures would help?
Cool. Yeah, that's a really good question, because it's all the go, isn't it? Boy, it's the way forward for sustainable agriculture. And yes, rabbits do not like thick vegetation. And there's all sorts of reasons. One is they pick up diseases when the vegetation's thick and damp. They pick up a liver disease called coccidiosis, and it knocks them down. Plus, they like to eat very short, fast-growing pasture. It's more nutritious, and that's the way their gut system's designed to eat, unlike hares, which can take taller, rougher stuff. And also, they like to be in open sort of habitats, which could be an anti-predator for a predator avoidance mechanism. I'm in an open habitat. I can see around if there's any threat, and then I'll go off to shelter. So, yes, anything that thickens up vegetation would be a good thing for reducing rabbit abundance. There's one there from Tom about how reluctant are rabbits to pass through vegetation belts, remnant forest patches.
Carry on. That's good.
Yeah. Could these act as barriers to re-invasion after removal? I don't really know the answer to that, because it'll be a function of how wide these vegetation belts are that you're talking about. If they're narrow, yes, a rabbit will push through under a fence. It'll push through vegetation for sure if it cuts across their home range. But if it's really big, then that could act as a deterrent. Depends on the scale. Adrian asks, what's the relation of rabbits with forest environments in New Zealand? Here in Tierra del Fuego, we saw impacts of rabbits in forest, overall chewing saplings in wintertime.
That's the one.
What's the relation of rabbits with forest environments? Yeah, my understanding, the problem with saplings in New Zealand and sapling growth and herbivory is mainly a hare issue, because hares are happy to nip off the tops of rougher material, whereas a rabbit will be more reluctant. They like that low grazing pasture. So hares are our main issue there for nipping the top off saplings.
Sarah asks, what are the most effective ways to fence and exclude rabbits from an area? We are interested in protecting new native plantings.
Okay, so the main thing with fencing is, well, there's the rabbit netting that you can get from all sorts of places. Rabbit netting that's well constructed, well maintained, and well surveilled. So you're constantly checking it. You need to bury the apron as a rule, if you can. Have an apron on the ground.
Yeah.
And make sure that they're not digging, because if they're high density, they'll dig under those fences. So you've got to be constantly checking your fence and get good fence constructors.
Rod asks, as you can see, are rivers an effective barrier to rabbit movements across landscapes?
Yeah, they are. Your rabbits they're not swimmers, hey. Now, I'm sure they do cross. I don't really know. But anything with any flow, a rabbit won't cross. But anything that's still, they'll probably get across there. But I haven't really got that at the tip of my tongue. Others might know better than me. So when you say it's an effective barrier, it all depends on the flow.
Yeah, of course. And this one came in Naseby Forest. A lack of control in the township due to safety is pretty good model for high numbers. Is that right?
Lack of control in lack of rabbit control in the township due to safety, pretty good model for high numbers. Yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, that whole Maniatota area is very rabbit prone, and they can quickly take over gardens and townships. It's amazing. You look at a town called Moraki on the east coast of Otago. It's just seething in rabbits. It's right on the coast, and it's a nice, benign climate and lots of pasture. The place is crawling with rabbits. So, yeah.
Well, fantastic presentation and great to have you here. There's one more that's just come in. What would you say large-scale rat removal can benefit rabbit populations, given competition would be removed?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yep. Yeah, it depends. It's complicated because it depends under that scenario that Ara's describing. Are rabbits being limited by food? If they're being limited by food and you remove rats and there's a food response, yes. But if they're not being limited by food, they're being limited by the climate or or rainfall, then maybe not. So it all depends. Ecology is complex, and it's very difficult to give generalizations.
And if people have got any questions they haven't been able to put today, or they just wanted some advice or just to chat about something, observations or some data, can you let us know again? How do we get in touch with you?
Just email me at norburyg@landcareresearch.co.nz.
And what do you say? I always get people to do this. What do you say to all of the community groups out there, but predominantly that are working so hard and so full on and creating, predator control areas? What do you say to them from someone that's been in the industry for quite some time to motivate them to continue going?
Keep in mind, what are you doing it for? The end game. The end game is New Zealand's amazing biodiversity. It's so unique compared to the rest of the world. And if predator eradication, if we can achieve that, that'd be awesome. So just keep the end game in mind, because there's nothing like wandering through the bush and listening to all those birds, or scurrying through our schist outcrops in central Otago and seeing our native lizards out on the rocks. It's just awesome. Yeah.
It's been great to talk to you. Keep up the great work, and I hope we get to chat with you again. To everybody that joined in today and sent in questions and Remember, we've recorded this so you can pass it on to other people that you know might be interested in Grant's talk, and stand by for the next one, the next webinar that we'll have really soon with Predator Free New Zealand Trust. Thanks to all the team that work hard on all of these things, and we'll see you again next time. Take care. Thanks, Grant.
Bye, everyone.